Most people believe their life isn't changing because they don't have the right opportunity, the right money, or the right connections. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Your life isn't changing because your standards haven't changed. You keep tolerating the same habits, the same excuses, the same patterns that are quietly shaping your destiny. You say you want more, but your daily actions are still loyal to your old identity. And as long as your behavior matches your comfort zone instead of your vision, nothing outside will ever shift. Think about it. Every result you have right now is not accidental. It is the product of repeated decisions. The way you think when nobody is watching, the way you respond when things get hard, the way you negotiate with your own discipline. You don't get stuck in life overnight. You drift into it slowly by accepting just this once, too many times. And the danger is what starts as a small compromise becomes your lifestyle. The moment you accept less from yourself, life stops challenging you and starts defining you. The second reason your life isn't changing is because you are waiting for motivation instead of creating momentum. People think action comes after feeling ready. But the truth is, feeling ready comes after action. You don't wait for confidence, you build it through repetition. You don't wait for clarity, you earn it by moving forward even when things are unclear. The problem is not that you are incapable, the problem is that you are inconsistent. And inconsistency kills more dreams than failure ever will. Now listen carefully, your environment is either shaping your success or silently destroying it. The people you surround yourself with, the conversations you repeat, the content you consume, they are either pulling you forward or dragging you backward. If you stay in the same environment that produced your current results, you will keep producing the same life. Growth demands discomfort, and discomfort demands separation from old patterns. You cannot evolve while remaining emotionally loyal to what is keeping you small. The turning point comes when you finally decide that enough is enough. Not in words, but in behavior. The moment you stop negotiating with yourself, the moment you stop saying tomorrow and start proving today, change doesn't require more time. It requires a higher standard. Raise your standard for discipline. Raise your standard for focus. Raise your standard for what you allow in your mind and in your life. Because the moment your standards rise, your excuses collapse. And here is the truth most people avoid. You don't need a new life, you need a new identity. The version of you that is stuck cannot solve the problems of the future. So you must become someone different, someone who follows through, someone who acts without delay, someone who chooses growth over comfort repeatedly until it becomes automatic. The real reason your life isn't changing is not because life is difficult. It's because you are still operating from an old version of yourself. The moment you change who you are, everything around you has no choice but to change with you. Right now, your life is not being shaped by what you want. It is being shaped by what you accept. There is a massive difference between desire and standard. You can desire a better body, more money, stronger discipline, or a meaningful life. But if your daily standards remain low, nothing around you will shift. Standards are not wishes. They are non-negotiable rules you set for yourself. And whether you realize it or not, every area of your life is already obeying the standards you have silently accepted. Think about how standards work in real life. You don't question brushing your teeth or charging your phone because those are built into your routine. In the same way, your current life has been built on automatic behaviors you no longer question. If you tolerate procrastination, that becomes your standard. If you accept distraction, that becomes your standard. If you allow yourself to quit when things get hard, that also becomes your standard. And once something becomes a standard, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels normal. The uncomfortable truth is that most people don't fail because they aim too high. They fail because they accept too low. They set big goals but live with small discipline. They dream of transformation but tolerate inconsistency. And over time, what they tolerate becomes their identity. You don't rise to your goals. You fall to your standards. That's why motivation alone never changes anything for long. Motivation can spark emotion, but only standards can create structure, and structure is what builds a new life. If you truly observe successful people, you will notice something simple but powerful. They do not negotiate with their standards. When they say they will do something, they treat it as final, not because they always feel like it, but because they refuse to break their own rules. This is what separates growth from stagnation. The moment you begin negotiating with yourself, I'll do it later, I'll start tomorrow, just this once, you are lowering your standard without even noticing it. And every lowered standard quietly becomes your new ceiling. Raising your standards is not about being perfect. It is about being consistent with who you decide to become. It means you stop accepting behavior that contradicts your goals. If you want a better future, you must stop tolerating a lazy present version of yourself. If you want discipline, you must stop allowing excuses to survive in your mind. Change begins when you become emotionally uncomfortable with your own mediocrity and decide that your current level is no longer acceptable. And the most powerful shift happens when you stop waiting for external change and instead upgrade your internal rules. You don't need a new environment, a new opportunity, or a new beginning. You need a new standard for how you show up every single day. The moment you decide, this is no longer acceptable for me, your life begins to reorganize itself around that decision. Because standards don't just change behavior. They change identity, and once identity changes, everything else has no choice but to follow. Excuses are the quiet poison that slowly stops your life from moving forward. They don't feel dangerous in the moment. In fact, they feel comforting. They give you temporary relief, a way to avoid discomfort, a way to protect your ego. But every time you choose an excuse, you are not solving a problem, you are delaying your growth. And what is delayed long enough eventually becomes a permanent limitation. The scary part is that excuses don't announce themselves as failure, they disguise themselves as logic. Most people don't realize how quickly excuses become a habit. At first, it starts small. I'm too tired today, I'll start tomorrow. I don't have the right time yet. These seem harmless, but they build a mental pattern. Your mind begins to learn that avoidance is acceptable. And once your brain learns that pattern, it becomes easier to repeat it the next day. Slowly, you stop acting based on what is necessary and start acting based on what feels comfortable. That is where stagnation begins, not in big failures, but in small justifications. The most dangerous thing about excuses is that they feel justified in the moment. Your mind is incredibly skilled at protecting you from discomfort, so it creates reasons that sound reasonable. But behind every excuse is a hidden truth: fear, laziness, uncertainty, or lack of discipline. Instead of facing that truth, the mind wraps it in a story. And if you keep believing your own stories, you stop challenging yourself. Growth never survives in an environment where excuses are allowed to speak louder than action. When you study people who remain stuck in life for years, you will notice a pattern. They are not lacking opportunities, they are lacking accountability. They have explanations for everything: why they couldn't start, why it didn't work, why the timing was wrong. But explanations are not progress. You can explain your situation endlessly and still remain in the same place. Life doesn't respond to explanations, it responds to execution. And the more you rely on excuses, the further you move away from responsibility, which is the foundation of change. There comes a point where excuses stop being harmless and start becoming identity. You no longer say, I didn't do it. You begin to think, I am the kind of person who doesn't do it. That shift is subtle but powerful. Once you accept that identity, your actions start matching it automatically. You stop pushing yourself, you stop expecting more, and your potential quietly gets buried under repeated justification. Stagnation is not a sudden event. It is the result of repeated permission given to excuses over time. Breaking out of this pattern requires a moment of honesty that most people avoid. It is the moment you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what am I allowing? Because the truth is, your life is not only shaped by what you do, but also by what you allow to continue. Every excuse you refuse to challenge becomes a boundary around your future. And every time you choose responsibility over justification, you quietly begin to move again out of stagnation and back into progress. Small compromises rarely look dangerous in the beginning. In fact, they often feel harmless, even logical. You tell yourself it's just one skipped workout, one late night, one delayed task, one distraction that doesn't really matter. But life doesn't record your intentions, it records your patterns. And every time you choose comfort over discipline, you are not just making a small decision, you are quietly reshaping your identity. What seems small today becomes the foundation of your future tomorrow. The problem with small compromises is that they don't stay small. They multiply silently. One skipped action turns into two, then becomes a habit of delay. One excuse becomes a mental permission slip for the next excuse. Over time, what you once controlled begins to control you. And the most dangerous part is that the shift is so gradual you don't notice it happening. You don't wake up one day in a different life. You drift into it through repeated small decisions. Most people underestimate how powerful consistency is in the wrong direction. You don't need one major failure to change your life. You only need repeated minor compromises. Missing one opportunity might not destroy your future, but repeatedly ignoring opportunities will. Every time you say, doesn't matter today, you are teaching your mind that discipline is optional. And once discipline becomes optional, your standards begin to collapse without any dramatic moment. If you observe closely, success and failure are not separated by one big decision. They are separated by thousands of small ones. The successful person is not always the most talented. They are often the most consistent with their standards. The unsuccessful person is not always incapable. They are often just slightly inconsistent for too long. That slightly is what creates the gap. Because over time, small gaps don't stay small. They expand into completely different realities. The tragedy is that most people only recognize the cost of their compromises when it is too late. They look back and think it was one big moment that changed everything, but in reality, it was a series of small permissions they gave themselves. Just this once, becomes a step away from their potential. And while each step feels insignificant, the direction matters more than the distance. You don't suddenly lose your life. You slowly hand it away through repeated tolerance of what you once said you wouldn't accept. Reversing this pattern requires awareness in the smallest moments, not the biggest ones. It means paying attention to what you allow when no one is watching, when there is no pressure, when there is no urgency. Because that is where your real life is being shaped. The future you are going to live is not decided in dramatic turning points. It is being written in the quiet decisions you make every single day, when you choose whether to stay aligned with your standards or slowly compromise them again. Small compromises rarely look dangerous in the beginning. In fact, they often feel harmless, even logical. You tell yourself it's just one skipped workout, one late night, one delayed task, one distraction that doesn't really matter. But life doesn't record your intentions, it records your patterns. And every time you choose comfort over discipline, you are not just making a small decision, you are quietly reshaping your identity. What seems small today becomes the foundation of your future tomorrow. The problem with small compromises is that they don't stay small, they multiply silently. One skipped action turns into two, then becomes a habit of delay. One excuse becomes a mental permission slip for the next excuse. Over time, what you once controlled begins to control you. And the most dangerous part is that the shift is so gradual you don't notice it happening. You don't wake up one day in a different life, you drift into it through repeated small decisions. Most people underestimate how powerful consistency is in the wrong direction. You don't need one major failure to change your life. You only need repeated minor compromises. Missing one opportunity might not destroy your future, but repeatedly ignoring opportunities will. Every time you say, it doesn't matter today, you are teaching your mind that discipline is optional. And once discipline becomes optional, your standards begin to collapse without any dramatic moment. If you observe closely, success and failure are not separated by one big decision. They are separated by thousands of small ones. The successful person is not always the most talented. They are often the most consistent with their standards. The unsuccessful person is not always incapable. They are often just slightly inconsistent for too long. That slightly is what creates the gap. Because over time, small gaps don't stay small. They expand into completely different realities. The tragedy is that most people only recognize the cost of their compromises when it is too late. They look back and think it was one big moment that changed everything, but in reality, it was a series of small permissions they gave themselves. Every just this once becomes a step away from their potential. And while each step feels insignificant, the direction matters more than the distance. You don't suddenly lose your life. You slowly hand it away through repeated tolerance of what you once said you wouldn't accept. Reversing this pattern requires awareness in the smallest moments, not the biggest ones. It means paying attention to what you allow when no one is watching, when there is no pressure, when there is no urgency. Because that is where your real life is being shaped. The future you are going to live is not decided in dramatic turning points. It is being written in the quiet decisions you make every single day when you choose whether to stay aligned with your standards or slowly compromise them again. Small compromises rarely look dangerous in the beginning. In fact, they often feel harmless, even logical. You tell yourself it's just one skipped workout, one late night, one delayed task, one distraction that doesn't really matter. But life doesn't record your intentions. It records your patterns. And every time you choose comfort over discipline, you are not just making a small decision. You are quietly reshaping your identity. What seems small today becomes the foundation of your future tomorrow. The problem with small compromises is that they don't stay small. They multiply silently. One skipped action turns into two, then becomes a habit of delay. One excuse becomes a mental permission slip for the next excuse. Over time, what you once controlled begins to control you. And the most dangerous part is that the shift is so gradual you don't notice it happening. You don't wake up one day in a different life. You drift into it through repeated small decisions. Most people underestimate how powerful consistency is in the wrong direction. You don't need one major failure to change your life. You only need repeated minor compromises. Missing one opportunity might not destroy your future, but repeatedly ignoring opportunities will. Every time you say, it doesn't matter today, you are teaching your mind that discipline is optional. And once discipline becomes optional, your standards begin to collapse without any dramatic moment. If you observe closely, success and failure are not separated by one big decision. They are separated by thousands of small ones. The successful person is not always the most talented. They are often the most consistent with their standards. The unsuccessful person is not always incapable. They are often just slightly inconsistent for too long. That slightly is what creates the gap. Because over time, small gaps don't stay small. They expand into completely different realities. The tragedy is that most people only recognize the cost of their compromises when it is too late. They look back and think it was one big moment that changed everything, but in reality, it was a series of small permissions they gave themselves. Every just this once becomes a step away from their potential. And while each step feels insignificant, the direction matters more than the distance. You don't suddenly lose your life. You slowly hand it away through repeated tolerance of what you once said you wouldn't accept. Reversing this pattern requires awareness in the smallest moments, not the biggest ones. It means paying attention to what you allow when no one is watching, when there is no pressure, when there is no urgency, because that is where your real life is being shaped. The future you are going to live is not decided in dramatic turning points. It is being written in the quiet decisions you make every single day when you choose whether to stay aligned with your standards or slowly compromise them again. Waiting for motivation feels harmless, but it is one of the biggest traps that keeps people stuck in the same place. You tell yourself you will start when you feel ready, when the energy is right, when the mind is clear, when the confidence shows up. But that moment rarely comes the way you imagine it. Motivation is not a signal that tells you to act. It is often the result of action. And if you keep waiting for it to arrive first, you are silently training yourself to delay your own life. The truth is, motivation is unreliable because it is emotional, and emotions are constantly changing. One day you feel inspired, the next day you feel drained. If your entire progress depends on how you feel, then your progress will always be unstable. That is why so many people start strong but stop quickly. They confuse excitement with discipline, but excitement fades while discipline survives. And only discipline can carry you through the moments when motivation disappears. When you take action without feeling ready, something powerful begins to shift inside you. What the mind starts adjusting to movement. Even a small step creates momentum, and momentum changes your emotional state. You begin to feel slightly more capable, slightly more focused, slightly more alive. That is how confidence is actually built, not by thinking, but by doing. Action is the trigger that rewires your internal state. Waiting for motivation keeps you stuck in thought, but action pulls you into reality. Most people believe they need clarity before they act, but clarity often comes after movement, not before it. If you stand still waiting for the perfect plan, you will overthink yourself into paralysis. But if you start moving with what you already know, even imperfectly, the next step begins to reveal itself. Life rewards motion. It does not reward hesitation. Every moment you delay action in search of perfect readiness is a moment you lose the opportunity to build momentum. There is also a hidden danger in waiting for motivation. It slowly weakens your belief in yourself. Every time you say, "I'll do it later," you are reinforcing the idea that you cannot act without emotional permission. And over time, you begin to trust your hesitation more than your ability. That is how potential quietly gets buried. Not because you are incapable, but because you keep outsourcing your action to your feelings instead of your decision. The shift happens when you decide that action is no longer optional. When you stop negotiating with your emotions and start leading them instead. Because once you prove to yourself that you can move without motivation, you unlock a different level of control over your life. You stop being someone who waits for the right moment and become someone who creates momentum in any moment. And that single shift is what separates people who stay stuck from those who finally begin to change. Inconsistency is one of the quietest killers of progress because it doesn't feel like failure in the moment. It feels like taking a break, starting again tomorrow, or getting back on track soon. But over time, these small breaks become a pattern, and that pattern becomes your reality. You don't notice the damage immediately because inconsistency doesn't destroy your progress in a single moment. It slowly dissolves it while you convince yourself that you're still moving forward. The mind naturally prefers comfort over commitment, so it allows inconsistency to feel acceptable. You might work hard for a few days, feel inspired, and then slowly drift back into old habits. That cycle repeats again and again. And while you believe you are still trying, your results remain unchanged because effort without consistency has no direction. It's like building a road, but stopping every few meters. You never reach the destination, no matter how strong your start is. What makes inconsistency so dangerous is that it creates the illusion of progress. You feel busy, you feel active, you feel like you are doing something important. But when you zoom out, nothing actually changes. This illusion keeps you comfortable because it tricks your mind into believing effort alone is enough. But life doesn't reward effort in isolation. It rewards sustained effort applied consistently over time. If you study high achievers closely, you will notice they are not always the most intense people, but they are the most reliable. They don't depend on bursts of energy. They depend on systems. They show up even when they don't feel like it. And that reliability is what compounds into success. Meanwhile, inconsistency breaks compounding. Every time you stop and start, you reset your progress and lose momentum. And without momentum, even simple goals start to feel heavy. The most painful part of inconsistency is that it slowly weakens your belief in yourself. Each time you fail to follow through on your own plan, a small piece of trust in yourself disappears. You begin to doubt your discipline, your focus, your ability to change. Not because you lack potential, but because you keep breaking promises to yourself. And self-trust is the foundation of every transformation. Without it, even the best plans collapse under doubt. The turning point comes when you stop treating consistency as something optional and start treating it as your identity. When you decide that showing up is no longer dependent on mood, motivation, or circumstances. Because once consistency becomes who you are, instead of what you do occasionally, everything begins to shift. Progress stops being random and starts becoming predictable. And that is when real change finally begins to take shape. Your environment is shaping your life far more than you realize, even when you believe you are in full control. The people you spend time with, the conversations you hear every day, the habits you observe, and the energy you absorb are constantly influencing your thoughts and decisions. You don't just live in your environment, you gradually become it. And that transformation happens so slowly that you rarely notice when it begins, but one day you wake up and realize your mindset has quietly adjusted to your surroundings. If you are surrounded by negativity, excuses, and limitation-based thinking, it becomes harder to believe in possibility. Not because you lack ambition, but because your environment keeps reinforcing doubt. When the voices around you constantly lower expectations, your mind starts accepting those limits as normal. Over time, what once felt like a big dream begins to feel unrealistic, not because it is impossible, but because your environment has reshaped your perception of what is possible. On the other hand, when you place yourself in an environment of growth, discipline, and forward thinking energy, something shifts inside you. You begin to think differently, act differently, and expect more from yourself. You don't need constant motivation because the environment itself pushes you forward. This is why two people with similar talent can end up in completely different places. Their environments are silently training them in opposite directions every single day. One of the most powerful truths is that you are influenced more by proximity than intention. You may intend to be disciplined, focused, and ambitious, but if your surroundings reward distraction and comfort, your intentions will slowly weaken. Human behavior adapts to what is normalized around it. If laziness is normal in your circle, discipline feels difficult. If growth is normal, discipline feels natural. You don't rise alone. You rise or fall based on what surrounds you. The danger of staying too long in the wrong environment is that it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels familiar. And familiarity is powerful enough to keep you stuck even when you know you want more. You start defending your environment instead of questioning it. You start adjusting your dreams instead of adjusting your surroundings. And slowly, your potential begins to shrink, not because it disappeared, but because it is no longer being supported or activated. Real change often begins the moment you become honest about your environment instead of loyal to it. When you recognize that staying comfortable around the wrong influence is costing you your future, because growth sometimes requires distance, change in relationships, change in habits, and change in inputs. The moment you change what surrounds you, you change what shapes you. And when what shapes you begins to rise, your entire life starts rising with it. Identity transformation is the real foundation of lasting change, because your life will never permanently rise above who you believe you are. You can change your habits for a few days, push yourself with motivation, or force discipline for a short time. But if your identity stays the same, you will eventually return to your old patterns. Everything you do flows from who you think you are, not just what you want to achieve. That is why real change is not about doing different things. It is about becoming a different version of yourself. Most people try to change their life by focusing only on actions, but actions are just the surface. Underneath every action is a belief, and underneath every belief is identity. If you believe, I am not disciplined, then every attempt to be disciplined feels like a struggle against yourself. But if your identity shifts to, I am someone who follows through, then discipline stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like natural behavior. The battle is never just external, it is always internal first. The reason people repeat the same failures is because they are still operating from an old identity. Even when they try new strategies, they carry the same mindset, the same self-image, the same internal story. So eventually, they sabotage their progress to match who they believe they are. It is not that they don't know what to do, it is that they don't believe they are the type of person who does it consistently. And identity always wins over intention. Real transformation begins when you stop asking, what do I need to do? And start asking, who do I need to become? Because when you change the answer to that question, your decisions automatically change. A person who sees themselves as disciplined does not debate whether to show up. They show up by default. A person who sees themselves as focused does not constantly fight distraction. They naturally choose clarity. Identity removes internal conflict because it aligns behavior with belief. The shift is not instant. It is built through repetition. Every time you act in alignment with the person you want to become, you strengthen that identity. And every time you break that alignment, you reinforce the old one. That is why small daily actions matter more than big occasional efforts. You are not just completing tasks, you are training your brain to accept a new version of you as normal. And once something becomes normal in your identity, it becomes permanent in your life. The most powerful moment in any transformation is when you stop trying to become and start deciding that you already are. Because when your identity changes, your behavior stops resisting change and starts expressing it naturally. You no longer chase discipline. You become disciplined. You no longer chase success. You embody the habits that create it. And at that point, life doesn't feel like constant effort anymore. It feels like alignment with who you have finally decided to be. In the end, the reason most people stay stuck is not because they lack knowledge, talent, or opportunity, but because they keep living inside the same patterns, excuses, and identity that created their current results. Real change is never about one big moment. It is about a series of small decisions that slowly reshape who you are becoming. The life you see today is simply the reflection of what you have repeatedly accepted, tolerated, and acted upon. But the moment you become aware of this truth, everything shifts. Because awareness gives you power. The power to interrupt old habits, challenge excuses, raise your standards, and choose differently in the moments that used to control you. Change doesn't require perfect conditions. It requires a firm decision to stop repeating what is no longer serving your future. And once that decision is made, even quietly, your direction begins to change. Your actions start aligning with your standards. Your environment begins to feel different, and your identity slowly starts to transform. Not overnight, but consistently, step by step, choice by choice. That is how real growth is built, not through sudden inspiration, but through committed transformation from the inside out.